So, Professor Anya, thank you for joining me on Beyond the News. First, let me ask you, what was the feeling like when you saw Joe Biden being sworn in as the 46th President of the United States of America? How did you feel in that very moment, being the person of color who had lived through 4 years of Trumpism?
Well, um, it was certainly a feeling of relief. Um, I am not just a person of color, I am a Black woman. And Black in this country is a lot deeper than just being a person of color. And it was a palpable relief for those of us who are Black to know that at least somebody who was not an outspoken white supremacist uh, was no longer in charge. So this was a relief. It definitely was. Now, white supremacism and systemic racism and the problems that we have here in the United States aren't restricted to just one man. And they don't begin or end with the leadership of just one man. These are endemic problems. These are problems that exist. These are structures and systems that we all have to deal with here and we all grapple with in every corner of our lives. Um, so I don't mean to say that now that Joe Biden has come in power, we don't have to worry about racism anymore. Um, I'm saying that it's a relief to know that an avowed and very open and explicit white supremacist is no longer the figurehead of this country. And then we can go ahead and work on systems and structures.
Um, I mean, when this election was done and over with, you had very otherwise brilliant constitutional lawyers like Ted Cruz. You had former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, openly disparaged the elections, questioned its legitimacy. And even till this very moment, you still have otherwise smart people claiming that the election was a fraud. Now, I'm here wondering if they are trying to express some level of fear, or this dishonesty and desperation that we see from these politicians is largely driven by a fear of a rapid demographic shift in America, where America is beginning to look more brown than white. Do you share, do you reckon with those fears?
Well, those men are opportunists, first and foremost. They are liars and they are immoral and craven and in many ways incompetent liars and opportunists. They want power and they desire power and the ability to have the connections and the leadership in place to run their agenda and to get rich. Um, that's first and foremost. I do not believe Ted Cruz or Rudy Giuliani or pretty much anyone in the GOP is principled in any way, not even in maintaining what they claim that their party ideologies are, because they tend to waffle in significant ways as the wind blows or as their base blows. So I want to make it very clear that neither one of those men realistically believes that there was fraud in the election. Well, they know that there was fraud in the election and wrongdoings because they were doing it. They're involved in voter suppression and all kinds of things to undermine the will of the people because they recognize, as you said, that serious demographic shifts and change in this country means that their electorate is shrinking. They're mostly, white, overwhelmingly white electorate is shrinking. Also, not just because of demographics, but because the Republican Party has no meaningful policy or anything to offer them or options to offer them because they really don't believe in anything except the richness of themselves and the corporations. So the demographics are changing, but then that's been a factor for a really long time. What they haven't really contended with, meaningfully, is the real electorate voting, because they've had such a stranglehold on, let's say, local government bodies that are in charge of districting. So, drawing district lines so you see who gets representatives and who gets representation, and who gets to make the rules and the laws about who votes and who doesn't. So they've managed to sort of outlive themselves by, I would say, more than a decade now, by gaming the system and outright cheating. So they are afraid, for sure, that they're no longer going to be able to do this, because the population is changing, and also because there's combat against their voter suppression and the rigging and the cheating that they've been doing to, maintain leadership in places where they right now don't even have the population to do that, or the electorate to do that. They are afraid of that. What I want to say is that their fear isn't their own irrelevance as much as their pockets running dry and their influence over the lawmakers and the corporations that enrich them becoming, well, less.
Very interesting point that you make. I mean, we all sat and watched on our TV screens how hundreds, if not thousands, of people assaulted, the legislative chamber in Washington, Capitol Hill. They tore down the buildings, ransacked properties, harassed legislators. I mean, it was a gory sight to behold. And I listened to many commentators who talked about how the police behaved when they saw this mob of white folks who were in support of Donald Trump approach the Capitol Hill, and how they treated them with respect, with dignity. And many made the argument that if we were Black people, or if we were Antifa, it would have been an entirely different story. And then we're reminded of systemic racism again. And I'm here wondering, every time something like this happens, whether it's George Floyd or the way that the police treated white people a lot differently from how they would have treated Black people in the march on Capitol Hill, we always have this debate. And the question I like to ask you is there some sort of hypocrisy, amongst Americans about who they really are? Or is there self-denial, or there's a willful forgetting of history, of the systemic racism that exists in America? Because every time this happens, you have politicians with their jaw dropped saying this is not who we are as Americans. And it happens over and over again. Is there some sense of self-denial about American history, or it's just simply plain lip service when these things happen over and over again?
Well, it depends, first of all, on the politicians that you're listening to, or the media figures, or whoever that you're listening to, in reaction to what they're seeing. Because chances are the people that are going to say this is not who we are people who've refused to acknowledge that this is indeed who we are, right? This is America. This is the way that things work here. And Black people, for the longest time, have been openly saying that this is not a democracy. This is not a place where everybody gets a fair shot. This is not the land of the free, because they certainly haven't been any of this, right? So depending on who you're talking to, if anybody comes and says, oh, wow, this is just not America, and this is not, they usually have the privilege of this not being their America and the way they experience this country, because the systemic inequity and the systemic racism and the white supremacy which exists in this country is very real and functions in every single way. I mean, we saw it in the insurrection itself and who participated in the insurrection. It's no longer a mystery why the Capitol Police, for example, they were caught on video allowing people the insurrectionists to come in and the mob to attack the place that they're supposedly protecting, right? We saw them taking selfies with the terrorists. And it is very clear now, so much as, arrests have been made, right? Among people who themselves were Capitol Police officers, off duty, or those who others saw very openly aiding and abetting the terrorism and insurrection. And we also noticed that, and the reports and arrests, suspensions have confirmed that we had military involved in this, right? And we had plainclothes or police officers from different departments across the country, right, coming in. So we understand very clearly that law enforcement in general and military in general in the United States, people say have been infiltrated by white nationalists and white supremacists. It's not an infiltration. It's the existence of what always was, right? If you look at the history of law enforcement in this country, it originated from slave patrols, from the white men who were given weapons. They weren't that much better, economically than those who were enslaved, but they were white and they were told they were better and they were given weapons to be able to control the Black people. And, with emancipation, the need for battalions or, little militias or little forces that would, corral the Black people and keep them in line and incarcerate them when necessary and when, demanded, and protect white property. All of this evolved into what we know now as law enforcement. So it's not a huge surprise that law enforcement till today still functions as a body to essentially control and hold Black people down, minoritize them, outright kill them, all kinds of things. So we also, reports have shown now that at the very highest level of the Pentagon, as in a general of the Army, right, General Flynn, was part of the phone call that when the Congress people, right, when the representatives and senators were under siege and under attack and people, breaking in and calling for their heads and they're barricading themselves in their office, knowing that they're going to be taken hostage. People were, threatening to kill them, had threatened to kill them. So this was a murderous rampage that was happening. These lawmakers called the Pentagon to get permission to get the US National Guard to come and help them and rescue them, and support. And a whole general involved in that call was part of the decision to say, no, we're not sending reinforcements for you. And they delayed for up to a whole hour, hour and a half until other machinations were, able to be done to get reinforcements. And state National Guard forces who couldn't come onto federal land, DC is federal land, and the states of Virginia and Maryland that are right next door to DC that have their own National Guard forces, couldn't send those forces to step on federal land without Pentagon permission. And we're waiting for hours to send help. Senators are calling them on their private phone, please help us. Nothing. And we now have discovered, the Washington Post just did a bombshell report on this last night, that a whole general was in there, a part of the insurrectionist plan and the coup attempt, essentially what it was, because they were trying to prevent the certification of the election of the person who was in power, his competitor, right? So this is essentially trying to overthrow a legally, democratically elected government. And a general participated in this, so much as preventing rescue from happening. So, and we now know more information is coming about the planning of it and who was involved in those high positions for planning. Now, why are they doing this? To maintain a white supremacist, white nationalist, right, racist, and profoundly inequitable power structure. This is how deep the rot goes in the United States. And it's not just this particular administration. We've seen it boldly and sort of most vividly with this administration. But how did a whole major party go lock in step with this administration because they already maintain these sentiments. And we have other insurrectionists, lawmakers, who voted against the certification of a legal vote that are still right now walking those same halls of government that they fomented attack against. And we saw that they even led tours, lawmakers themselves, right, who were sympathizers to the overthrow attempt, led reconnaissance missions, right, for the insurrectionists and the terrorists to come in the day before, give them maps, show them where it is that they can get around, right? So in this violent episode, we're able to see just how structural this mess is and continues to be, regardless of the election of Joe Biden.
Okay, so final question I'd like to ask you. It's a two-in-one question, anyways. I like the fact that you said that this systemic racism has existed even before Trump became president. I think his antics only exacerbated the problem, and it's emboldening a lot of white supremacists across the country. But what kind of institutional and systemic change would you like to see that may nip this Trumpism in the bud and will give people of color some sense of dignity in America? And are you confident and hopeful that in your lifetime, America will live up to its true creed, where all men are born equal and persons are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character?
Well, that's certainly a promise, right? It's not something that was ever, even the people that were signing those papers and making declarations of the equality of everybody were holding hundreds of people enslaved. And, we know Thomas Jefferson, we know George Washington himself, the father of the nation, was particularly obsessed with the lifetime pursuit of one enslaved woman who had run away from him and spent a whole life. So these are believers in equality that, it really didn't mean much for anybody except their own kind. And that's the way we've always understood America and sort of worked with America, and knowing that, it's good for some and really bad for most. So what I believe, or what I hope happens first and foremost, is the restoration of the Voting Rights Act, right? We had a system in place where voting was monitored very, very closely, especially in states that had a history of disenfranchising Black people and putting all kinds of tactics and structures in place so the least amount of Black people vote, and they're not able to make any meaningful change in their governance and also their material lives, because governing decisions are influenced by those who make them. So the very first thing I really, really hope that they work on is to restore this Voting Rights Act that was gutted by the Supreme Court. And the minute that they destroyed this Voting Rights Act was when the floodgates opened for all of the voter ID laws, all of the suppression, and much more of it, let's say, than what was happening before. Because at least the federal government can come and look at what they were doing and say, no, per the Voting Rights Act, you can't, take away 100,000 names from the rolls, the registration rolls, and say the 100,000 people who happen to be majority Black can't vote no more, because they didn't sign their name properly or they didn't vote the last time. So these are things that I think is a relatively quick fix, right? If we can get the political will to do it. Easy fix is not the same as quick. If we can get some kind of legislation that takes a closer look at how the voting rights were gutted. So then when we start to shore up and really address suppression of votes, right? We see, for example, what happened in Georgia and how, it was just assumed that Georgia is going to be a red state. And red state in this country means white power, white rule, because Republicans are overwhelmingly white and they vote for white interests and they vote for white power structures. So when you call somewhere a red state, you mean that it's white people in charge and they're going to stay in charge. And Georgia was like that, and it was assumed to be like that. And the Black activists on the ground said, Georgia is not a red state, in that there is enough of a diversity in the population of Georgia, so it doesn't always maintain the interests of essentially a white minority. And they proved that when they fought against voter suppression and all kinds of machinations that the Georgia state government was doing to deny Black people the right to vote. And when they did all kinds of registration, when they fought against the suppression, they took it to the laws and everything, they ended up showing the whole country. Then not only is Georgia not a red state, you can have 2 Democratic senators and also a Black governor come out of Georgia, because we know Stacey Abrams won that governorship, but Brian Kemp cheated his way into victory because he was also in charge of the election while at the same time running for office. So we know that voting is where we have the most power, for better or for worse, in this country, and the most voice and the most opportunity to make real sustainable change. And to me, if you attack those who are attacking the right of all to vote, that is where we can make the most meaningful change, because we can decide who our leaders are, and our leaders are the ones making laws and making bigger decisions for everyone. And if we really make sure that we put competence in office, 400,000 Americans just died, right? We've reached the 400,000 mark for the number of deaths in this coronavirus. This is unimaginable for a country with the wealth and the resources and the scientific knowledge of this country. And it all came down to competent leadership, more leadership that we severely lack administration. So even just to make sure we're not killing people outright in preventable ways, not to talk of the way we kill them systemically and structurally, through deprivation of resources, healthcare, etc. But just that we don't kill them from the plague because we had incompetent management of a pandemic. Leadership makes those decisions and makes that difference. And if we can vote for good leadership, enough of us vote for good leadership, real change can happen in this country.
Fantastic way to end this conversation. Thank you so very much, Professor Aya. It was really, really an enlightening conversation with you. And I do wish that I could do this again sometime in the future. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.